The snow came without ceremony. That was the thing about the worst storms. They didn't announce themselves with thunder or warning winds. They arrived the way death arrived in the territory, quietly, sideways, and with complete indifference to your plans. On the morning of January the 14th, 1889, Elias Cord stepped out of the Clearwater Gulch Sheriff's Office to find that the world had been replaced overnight with a white wall that ended 6 inches from his face. He stood there for a moment in his long underwear and suspenders, one boot on and one boot in his hand, studying the situation the way a man studies a bad hand of cards. Not with panic, but with the slow, grinding recognition that the game has already turned against him. He pulled on his other boot and went back inside. There were 11 people in Clearwater Gulch that morning. Elias Cord himself was 53 years old, a former deputy U.S. Marshal who had taken the sheriff's post 4 years ago when his knees gave out on long rides and his eyes started playing tricks on him in low light. He was not a sentimental man. He had been a fair man once, and occasionally he still was. He knew the others the way a man knows the contents of a room he has lived in for years. Not with affection necessarily, but with the intimate familiarity of someone who has long since stopped seeing the furniture and started seeing only what's missing. He knew Ruth Abernathy, 61, who ran the general store with the ledger balanced to the cent and the flour measured to the ounce, and who had a daughter in Colorado she hadn't heard from in 2 years. He knew Daniel Farr, 26, the school teacher from Philadelphia, who had arrived in September with 3 trunks of books, and the persistent conviction that the children of the territory deserved the same education as the children of Beacon Hill. There were no children in Clearwater Gulch, and he had been teaching the adults instead on Thursday evenings, to mixed results. He knew Reverend Joachim Berger, stout and German-born, who had come west 17 years ago as a missionary and stayed because, as he said, the sinners were more interesting. He knew Magnus Holt, 44, Norwegian, who ran the livery with the quiet efficiency of a man who trusted animals more than people and had good reasons for both preferences. Magnus kept 6 horses in that livery, and he knew each one the way other men knew their children. He knew Doc Ansel Pruitt, 70 years old and sharp as a splinter, who had been practicing medicine in the territory for 22 years and had stopped practicing and started improvising sometime around 1870, and who carried a flask of rye whiskey in his left breast pocket for reasons he described as medicinal. He knew Margaret Holt, no relation to Magnus, the Gulch's midwife and nurse, 40 years old, who had delivered 41 babies and lost only 3 and kept a record of both numbers. And he knew Thomas Beaumont, 38, who owned the saloon and played the piano well enough that people sometimes forgot he was charging them 4 times what the whiskey was worth, and who owed debts to men in 3 different states. That made 9. The other 2 were in his jail. In the first cell sat Luther Briggs, 58 years old, thick through the shoulders, with gray stubble and eyes the color of old creek water. He had killed a man in a card dispute in Billings in November, and had been in Cord's custody ever since, waiting on the federal circuit judge who traveled the territory on a schedule that depended entirely on the weather. And the weather, as of this morning, had made its position on the matter very clear. In the second cell sat Cody Pell, 19 years old, who had stolen 3 horses from a ranch outside of Judith Basin and had the misfortune of being caught, not because he was stupid, but because his own horse went lame, and he'd sat down by the road to wait for help. When the rancher's men found him, he was feeding one of the stolen horses the last of his own corn. That detail had lodged in Cord's memory like a splinter he couldn't locate. 11 people, 1 blizzard. And in the supply room behind Ruth Abernathy's counter, enough food. Flour, dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, canned goods, a half-barrel of potatoes, and 3 months of careful accumulation against exactly this kind of winter, to feed 9 people comfortably through March. Cord was the first one to do the arithmetic. He sat at his desk with a pencil and a scrap of paper and ran the numbers twice, then set the pencil down and looked at the wall for a long time. He was the sheriff, and the numbers were his responsibility, and the numbers were 2 people short of working out. He went to find Ruth Abernathy. By the second day, the snow had reached the windowsills. The telegraph line that connected Clearwater Gulch to the relay station at Pilgrim Creek, 12 miles east, had gone down sometime in the night. Cord found this out when Magnus came to report that the wire was down between the livery and the pole at the gulch's edge, snapped clean by the weight of ice. There was no way to know how far the break extended or when it might be repaired. There was no way to know much of anything beyond the walls of the 6 structures that constituted their world. Cord called the meeting in the general store because it was the largest space and had the most reliable stove. Everyone came except Magnus, who sent word through Margaret that he was staying with the horses because 2 of them were already weak from cold, and he wasn't leaving until he was sure they weren't going to die. No one argued with this. Ruth presented the numbers, standing at the counter with her ledger open and her reading spectacles at the end of her nose. She read the figures in the same flat, precise voice she used for everything. Debts, deaths, weather, inventory. When she finished, she closed the ledger. The silence lasted a long time. 9, said Thomas Beaumont. He was sitting on a flour barrel with his coat pulled close, and he said the word the way you say a word when you're hoping someone will tell you you've misheard it. 9, comfortably, Ruth said. If we ration carefully, 9 people can eat through to March, possibly a few days beyond. And there are 11 of us, Daniel Farr said. He had gone very still in the way young people go still when reality first shows them its full face. There are 11 of us, Ruth confirmed. Reverend Berger folded his hands on the table in front of him. The Lord will provide, he said, but he said it quietly, as a man says something he needs to believe, rather than something he does believe. The Lord, Doc Pruitt said from his chair in the corner, has not reviewed the supply manifest. He took a sip from his flask. The numbers are what they are. Cord had been listening from the doorway. There is a second issue, he said. Everyone looked at him. The 2 men in my jail. I have enough feed for the cells for maybe 3 weeks. After that, they eat from the same pot as the rest of us. Or they don't eat. Then they don't eat, Beaumont said. The room went quiet in a different way. I won't do that, Cord said. You'll let prisoners eat our food. I won't starve men in my custody. I don't care what they did. That's not how I operate. Beaumont started to say something and stopped. Reverend Berger nodded slowly. Daniel Farr was looking at the floor. Then we are 11, Ruth said. She closed the ledger with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. And we need to decide what that means. Nobody decided anything that day. They dispersed instead, back to whatever structure was serving as their shelter, and Cord walked back through the snow to the jail with 2 plates of beans and cornbread, 1 for each cell, measured to exactly the same portion as what the others were eating. Luther Briggs took his plate without a word. Cody Pell looked at the plate, then at Cord, then back at the plate. You don't have to do this, the boy said. I know, Cord said. He went back to his desk and stared at the wall for a long time, turning the arithmetic over and over like a stone with no good side. By the end of the first week, they had settled into a rough rhythm. Not because the situation had improved, but because human beings find routine even in catastrophe. Sometimes, especially in catastrophe. Magnus brought his 2 weakest horses into the livery's back stall and built a small fire in an old drum and saved them. He said nothing about this to anyone except Margaret, who had gone to help and stayed for 3 hours. Margaret left feeling steadier than she had in days, and could not entirely explain why. Daniel Farr began conducting daily lessons in the general store for anyone who came. Ruth came every morning. Reverend Berger came. Thomas Beaumont came twice, then stopped when Farr began discussing the philosophy of social contracts, and Beaumont couldn't tell if he was being lectured or accused. Doc Pruitt made his rounds each morning with his black bag, taking pulses and asking questions, checking on Briggs through the bars and sitting with Pell long enough each visit to make the boy feel seen rather than surveilled. He was not troubled by the limits of his medicine. He was old enough to know that most of what ailed people in a crisis was the crisis itself, and for that, the best treatment was showing up. And Cord watched. He had always done this, long before he became a lawman. Watched people the way a river watches a bank, noting the small erosions that precede the large ones. He watched Beaumont calculate the supplies with his eyes each time he entered the store. He watched Ruth reseal the jars each evening and make small marks in her ledger. He watched Farr writing letters he could not send, piling them neatly on the schoolroom table like unanswered prayers. And he watched his 2 prisoners. This was the thing he had not told anyone at the meeting. Luther Briggs had begun, quietly, without asking permission, to fix things. It started with the stove. The cell block's heating stove had drawn wrong all winter, filling the room with smoke before reluctantly producing heat. Briggs, who had apparently spent years in his youth working a forge in West Virginia, asked Cord for a length of wire and a pair of pliers. Cord gave them to him after a long moment of consideration. Briggs spent an afternoon rerouting the flue connection with a patience and precision that Cord found unsettling in a man awaiting judgment. The stove drew perfectly after that. Then Briggs had begun to treat Cody Pell. The boy had developed a cough in the 2nd week, the dry, sawing kind that starts innocuous and becomes, in cold and confinement, something more serious. Briggs, without comment, had torn a strip from his own blanket and fashioned a compress. He asked Cord for dried sage from the store and demonstrated how to brew it into a steam that helped the cough loosen. He instructed Pell to sleep on his side instead of his back and to drink water slowly and often. And once each evening, through the bars between their cells, he checked on the boy with the calm authority of someone who had done this before. One evening, near the end of the 2nd week, Cord heard them talking. Not the treatment, just talking. Pell's voice first, low and uncertain. "You ever been scared? In a place like this?" A long silence. Then Briggs. "Every time. Being scared means you still got something worth losing. That's not nothing, boy." Cord kept his eyes on his desk. He did not write down what he had heard. Some things belonged to the room they were spoken in. When Cord asked where Briggs had learned the medical treatments, the older man looked at his hands. Large hands, scarred across the knuckles. "My mother," he said. "She was a midwife." Cord was quiet for a moment. "You killed a man," he said. "Yes," Briggs said. "Was it a fair fight?" "He drew first. A beat, if that's what you mean." "That's not what I mean." Briggs looked at his hands again. "He was going to kill a boy," he said at last. "Younger than Pell. The boy owed him money and couldn't pay, and the man had decided that was sufficient reason. I was sitting at the table, and I watched it developing, and I made a decision." He stopped. "It wasn't a card dispute. That's what I told the deputies, because a card dispute is something people understand. What actually happened is harder to explain." "You could have told the circuit judge that." The boy was long gone by then. No one to corroborate. And I have a history that doesn't recommend me to circuit judges." He said it without self-pity. She stayed 2 hours, asking the boy questions in the direct, unhurried manner of someone accustomed to patients who don't think their symptoms matter enough to mention. On her way out, she paused at Cord's desk. "The man in the other cell," she said. "He knows what he's doing." "I know," Cord said. "How long has he been treating him?" 10 days. Margaret looked at the cell block door for a moment, then, "The boy would have had a serious infection by now without the steam treatments. Maybe worse." She picked up her bag. Number 1. I'll come back tomorrow. She did. She came back every day after that, and on the 3rd visit, she brought her notebook and sat beside the cell bars and asked Briggs to walk her through his methods step by step while she wrote them down. Briggs answered each question carefully, in the manner of a man who takes being asked seriously, things seriously. When she left that afternoon, there was something changed in the way she carried herself. Not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a person who has found an unexpected resource in a place they'd stopped looking. At the end of the 3rd week, Ruth called another meeting. There had been 2 days of thin sun in the middle of the 2nd week, enough to raise hopes without delivering on them. Then the clouds closed back in, and the temperature dropped 20 degrees overnight. The telegraph line remained down. The world beyond the gulch had not changed its mind about. Ruth presented the numbers again. She had had 3 weeks to refine her calculations, and her refinements were not encouraging. At current consumption, 9 people could eat until the 2nd week of March. The snow, historically, broke sometime between the 10th and the 20th of March in this part of the territory. 11 people would run out of food somewhere in the last week of February. The gap was not large. It was large enough. "There are options," Daniel Farr said. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "We could reduce everyone's rations further." Doc Pruitt shook his head. "At the temperatures we're running, the body needs a minimum caloric intake to maintain core heat. Below that threshold, you start losing people to exposure regardless of shelter. Reducing further gets people killed by a different mechanism. The end result is the same." Beaumont was standing near the window, looking out. He had been quiet for most of the week, which Cord found more troubling than his usual noise. "We could put the prisoners on reduced rations," he said without turning around. "I'm not suggesting we starve them. I'm suggesting that the 2 people here, not by choice but by legal custody, receive appropriately reduced portions." "I am the law here," Cord said, "and I've decided." "You've decided," Beaumont said, turning now, "but you haven't explained why your decision outranks everyone else's survival." "Because I'm the one responsible for those 2 men. Because they have no other advocate in this room. And because the kind of community that decides some lives matter less than others based on who's convenient to exclude is not the kind of community I'm willing to be part of." He held Beaumont's gaze. "That's why." The room was quiet. "There's a 3rd option," Ruth said. She had not looked up from her ledger. She said it in the same voice she used for everything, and it landed in the room the way a stone lands in still water. "Someone could leave." The words sat there among them. "In these conditions," Farr began. "I know what the conditions are," Ruth said. "I'm not advocating for it. I'm naming it. We should name the things we're thinking so we can look at them properly." The silence that followed was a particular kind. The silence of a room full of people who have been thinking the same thing and are relieved and ashamed in equal measure to hear it said aloud. "I've been thinking it," Beaumont said. He looked surprised at his own honesty. "I know," Ruth said. She wasn't unkind when she said it. Thinking it about whom? Farr asked. No one answered. The stove crackled. The wind pressed at the window glass with the patient, impersonal force of something that had all the time in the world. Meeting's over, Cord said. He stood up. No one is leaving. No one is going on reduced rations. We are going to figure this out. He let the room feel the weight of it. Get some sleep. Eat your portions. Come back to me if you have a practical idea. He said it the way people say things when they're not fully sure they believe them, which is sometimes the only way to say them at all. That night, Cord couldn't sleep. He sat at his desk with a candle burning low and listened to his two prisoners, Pell's breathing, ragged and slow on the inhale, easier on the exhale. Briggs' silence, which was the silence of a man who is awake and also listening. After a while, Cord said, without turning around, "You awake, Briggs?" "Yes," Briggs said. "How much of what's been said in that store have you been able to hear?" "Enough." Cord turned his chair to face the cells. Briggs was sitting on his bunk with his back against the wall and his forearms on his knees. In the candlelight, he looked old and solid, like something carved from pale wood. "I want to ask you something," Cord said. "All right." "The man you killed in Billings, the boy you said you were protecting." Cord watched his face. "If I sent a telegraph to Billings when the line comes back up, would anyone corroborate that story?" Briggs met his eyes. "There was a deputy who took a statement from the boy in December. I don't know if the report still exists." "I'm not asking you to dig for it." "I'm not asking what you're asking me," Cord said. "I'm asking if it's worth looking." Briggs was quiet for a long moment. "It's worth looking," he said. Cord nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then, "What would you do if you were me with the food situation?" Briggs thought about this genuinely. He was a man who took questions seriously before answering them. "Make sure everyone feels necessary," he said at last. "Not as a transaction, as a fact. People who feel useless in a tight situation get dangerous. Not because they're bad, but because uselessness is its own kind of starvation. Give everyone something that only they can do, and you reduce the chance someone does something desperate." "That's practical," Cord said. "I've been in tight situations. I know what you've done. You know one thing I've done." Briggs looked at his hands. "A man is more than the worst thing he ever did. Or he ought to be. I've thought about it often enough that I've stopped being sure, but I haven't stopped hoping." Cord blew out the candle and sat in the dark for a moment. Then, "Get some sleep." "You too, Sheriff," Briggs said. In the morning, Cord went to Magnus. The Norwegian was in the livery before sunrise, as he always was. The two weak horses stood now, both of them eating slowly from a hay rack that Magnus had repaired with baling wire. The other 4 horses stood in their stalls in the dim warmth that Magnus had sustained since the storm began, feeding the drum stove one careful stick at a time. "Magnus," Cord said, "how much feed do you have left?" Magnus told him. It was not a large number. "If we kept only the 2 strongest horses, if we reduced to 2, how long would your feed last?" Magnus turned from the hay rack. He looked at Cord with the steadiness of a man who understands what's being asked and is deciding whether to make it easy or hard. "Are you asking me to kill 4 horses?" he said. "I'm asking what the arithmetic looks like." Magnus turned back to the horses. He ran his hand along the neck of the nearest one, a bay mare he had brought inside during the first week of the storm, in the dark, alone, without telling anyone. His hand stayed on her neck for a long moment, still and deliberate. The way a man touches something he is saying goodbye to without words. The feed, stretched across 2 animals, would last another 3 weeks, he said finally. Maybe 4. And the meat, Cord said, properly salted. The livery went very quiet. Outside, the wind worked at the boards. You'd need to kill them clean, Magnus said, his voice unchanged in the way that voices go unchanged when the feeling behind them is too large for inflection. Salt the cuts immediately, or you lose half of it to freezing wrong. I know how to do it. I've done it before. Not horses, but I know the method. I would need to be the one to do it, not anyone else. All right, Cord said. And I choose which 2 we keep. All right. Magnus nodded once, a small motion, the kind that closes a chapter rather than a conversation. Give me until tomorrow morning, he said. I want one more night. Cord left him there and walked back through the snow to his office. He sat at his desk and added the new numbers to the existing. With the horses factored in, and with the ration reduction Doc Pruitt had approved as medically sustainable, he ran the arithmetic carefully, twice, and both times arrived at the same result. 11 people could eat until the 15th of March. The snow, historically, broke between the 10th and the 20th. It was thin. It was very thin. But it was a margin, and a margin was all you needed if you could hold it. From the cells he could hear Pell coughing, and then the low sound of Briggs' voice, patient, unhurried, telling the boy to breathe slowly through his nose and hold the warmth in. Cord listened to this for a moment, then went to the store to tell Ruth to adjust her numbers. On the 38th day, Beaumont came to the jail after the last meal, when the Gulch had gone quiet. He knocked on the door. Knocked as though he wasn't sure of his welcome. And when Cord opened it, he came in and sat across the desk and turned his hat in his hands and did not speak for a full minute. Cord waited. He had learned long ago that the right silence was the most useful tool a lawman had. I need to tell you something, Beaumont said. All right. He turned his hat twice more. He was a handsome man, but in the weeks since the blizzard, something in his face had shifted, the way a well-kept thing shifts when it stops being kept. He looked like himself, but older and less defended. There's a crate, he said, behind a false wall in the saloon's back room. I had it built when I first came here. I put supplies in it, flour, dried beans, salt, some canned goods, enough for... He stopped, started again. Enough for 3 people. Maybe 4. Cord looked at him for a long moment. When did you put it there? 4 years ago, when I arrived. Beaumont set his hat on his knee. I've been in situations before. In Kansas, in Missouri. I learned to keep an exit available. A margin, for myself. A margin, Cord said. I know what it sounds like. What does it sound like? Beaumont met his eyes. It sounds like a man who is planning, at some point, to let other people go without so that he wouldn't have to. He held the gaze. I don't know that I would have actually done it. I'd like to believe I wouldn't have. But I kept it secret for 38 days while everyone else ate reduced portions and Magnus did what he had to do in that livery. He stopped. The muscles in his jaw tightened. So I don't get to claim I'm a good man just because I never had to make the final choice. The stove ticked. From the cells, Cord could hear Pell's breathing, steadier now, the cough nearly gone over the last week. He could hear nothing from Briggs' cell, which meant Briggs was awake and listening. Why tonight? Cord said. Beaumont looked at his hat. Because I've been sitting in that saloon listening to Farr read about social contracts, and I kept thinking about what my father would make of me. He almost smiled, but not quite. He's been dead 20 years. It's an absurd thing to be thinking about.
Was he a good man?
A very good man. And I've spent most of my adult life trying to be smart instead of good because I was afraid good wasn't going to be enough out here. He put his hat on his knee and stopped turning it. I think I was wrong about that.
Cord sat back in his chair. He thought about what Briggs had said. A man is more than the worst thing he ever did. And then he thought about what Beaumont had just done, which was come here voluntarily and offer the thing he'd been hoarding at the cost of the story he'd been telling himself about who he was. These were not the same thing as goodness, but they were in the same direction.
Go get the crate, Cord said. Bring it to Ruth's store tonight. We'll account it in the morning. Beaumont stood. He looked lighter in the way that people look lighter when they've put something down. Not happy, because lightness and happiness are not the same thing, but lighter. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me, Cord said. Go get the crate. After Beaumont left, Cord sat in the quiet. Then, without turning, You heard that? Yes, Briggs said. What do you think? A long pause. I think it's harder to be honest about who you are than honest about what you've done, Briggs said. Most people never manage it. Cord nodded, though Briggs couldn't see him. Then he added the new numbers to his running tally. With Beaumont's crate integrated into Ruth's inventory, the margin extended another 10 days. The 25th of March, if they held discipline. The snow would be gone by then. The snow had to be gone by then. He went to sleep for the first time in several nights without lying awake doing arithmetic. On the 42nd day, Reverend Berger came to the jail in the afternoon. He came in, shook snow from his coat, and accepted the coffee Cord poured in. He wrapped both hands around the cup and said, without preamble, "On Sunday, I would like to hold service here, in this room, with all 11 of us." Cord looked at him. "You want to hold church in a jail. I want to hold church with 11 people," Berger said. "The distinction you're drawing is one I've been examining carefully, and I've concluded it's the wrong one." He sipped his coffee. "I spent Tuesday afternoon speaking with Briggs about Bonhoeffer's theology of costly grace. That man has thought harder about justice and mercy than anyone I've encountered in 10 years of ministry in this territory. I'd like to acknowledge that, in the room where it matters." Cord said nothing. "And the boy?" Berger continued. "Pell told me he has never been inside a church in his life. Never been inside a school either, until Farr started teaching him through the bars." He set his cup down. "We have eaten together, suffered together, slept through the same storms, and saved each other's lives in small ways and large ones. And on Sunday evenings, we close 2 of us out." He spread his hands. "I cannot justify that anymore." Cord thought about the stove that drew correctly because Briggs had fixed it. He thought about Pell's cough, nearly gone because Briggs had treated it, and Margaret had built on that treatment every day since. He thought about Beaumont's crate, now accounted in Ruth's ledger and adding 10 days to their margin. "Cell doors stay closed," Cord said. "Of course. Briggs stays in his cell. I wasn't suggesting otherwise." Berger picked up his coffee. "I'm suggesting we conduct ourselves as though the bars are a legal formality rather than a moral verdict." He looked at Cord over the rim of the cup. "Which, as you have clearly come to believe yourself, they are." The service was held on the 47th day. Ruth brought 2 chairs from the store. Margaret brought a candle. Daniel Farr brought his Bible. Thomas Beaumont brought nothing but himself, and he sat in the back, and he was there, which Cord counted as sufficient.
Magnus came in from the livery, smelling of horses and hay, and sat beside Margaret without speaking. Doc Pruitt sat in the corner with his flask untouched for the full hour, and once, just once, he caught Pell's eye through the cell bars and gave the boy a small nod, the kind that says, "You made it this far. Keep going." Berger read from Luke, not the passage about forgiveness, not the passage about judgment, though both would have been obvious. He chose instead the story of the travelers on the road to Emmaus, two people who walked a long way with a stranger and recognized him only at the moment he broke bread with them. He did not explain why he'd chosen it. He let it sit in the room and do its own work. Briggs listened from his cell with his hands folded and his face unreadable in the candlelight. Cody Pell sat on the edge of his bunk and listened with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly forward, the posture of someone straining towards something just out of reach. At one point, Berger said the word grace, and Pell looked up quickly, as though the word had moved in the room, as though it had passed close enough to touch. After the reading, Berger said, "I will not speak about our situation. You know our situation. I will speak briefly about what I have observed in 7 weeks." He paused. "I have observed 11 people who did not choose each other, who would not, under ordinary circumstances, have chosen each other, conducting themselves with dignity. Not perfect, not without fear or selfishness or the small cruelties that come from being frightened." His eyes moved briefly to Beaumont, who did not look away. "But with dignity, which is the only thing I have ever found to be stronger than the conditions we're living in." He closed his Bible. "Let us pray," he said. Cord bowed his head. He did not pray exactly. He hadn't found the mechanism for that in many years, and he didn't pretend otherwise. But he sat in the silence of other people praying and found that it was, unexpectedly, enough. When he raised his head, he found Briggs looking at him through the bars. Between them, the cell bars made a grid of shadows across the floor. Outside, the wind pressed at the building's seams, patient, indifferent, doing what wind does. But in the room, at least for this hour, it seemed like something happening at a distance, to people in another story. The snow broke on March the 12th. It broke without ceremony, without announcement, with the same complete indifference with which it had arrived. The clouds parted one morning, and there was sun, genuine sun, flat and gold, laying itself across a world that had been white and gray for 8 weeks. The temperature rose 11 degrees in 2 hours. Everyone who was ambulatory went outside. Ruth Abernathy stood on the porch of her store and tilted her face toward the sun and closed her eyes. For a moment, the 61 years of careful keeping did not show on her face at all. Magnus stood in the livery doorway and watched his 2 remaining horses stand in the new light, with their heads up and their ears forward, the way horses do when the world returns to them. He watched them for a long time. No one interrupted him. Daniel Farr walked to the eastern edge of town and stood looking toward Philadelphia, toward everything he'd left behind, and then turned around and came back. He did not explain this. He didn't need to. Thomas Beaumont sat on the steps of the saloon and watched the others come out one by one into the morning. He did not play piano. He had not played since the night he'd retrieved the crate, and no one had asked him to. But he watched, and there was something in the watching that was different from before. Less calculation, more attention. Doc Pruitt declared Pell fully recovered that afternoon. Pell walked outside in his sock feet, stood in the snow up to his ankles, and laughed. A sudden, uncomplicated sound that stopped several people mid-motion and made them listen as though they were hearing something they'd forgotten the name of. From the livery doorway, Magnus watched the boy laugh. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face shifted, briefly, toward it. The telegraph line was repaired 6 days later, on the 18th, when a crew came out from Pilgrim Creek on horses loaded with wire and tools. By evening, the line was up. Cord sent 3 messages, one to the Territorial Marshal's office reporting the status of his prisoners, one to the Circuit Court requesting a date for Judge Harlow, and one, brief, factual, to the relay station at Billings requesting any records pertaining to a disturbance at a saloon in November of the previous year involving a young man with a knife wound. The reply from Billings came on the 21st. A deputy named Carver had taken a statement in December from a young man who'd appeared at the Justice of the Peace with a stab wound. The man's statement referenced an older, gray-haired stranger who had intervened before the injury worsened. The young man's name was recorded. The report existed. Cord read the telegraph twice, folded it, and put it in the folder he was building for the circuit judge. The federal circuit judge arrived on March the 26th, on a horse that looked nearly as exhausted as its rider. Judge Harlow was a small, neat man who wore his authority the way a man wears a coat he's owned for decades. Not showy, just present. He reviewed the files in Cord's office over the course of 2 days, took testimony from Cord and from the prisoners, read the affidavit that Farr had helped Briggs compose 3 weeks earlier at Cord's request, and reviewed the Billings telegraph with the careful attention of a man who understood that what a document says and what it means are sometimes different things. For Cody Pell, he rendered judgment on the afternoon of the 27th. 3 years at the Territorial Prison in Deer Lodge, with eligibility for early release, given the first offense and the character testimony provided by the attending physician, the midwife, the reverend, the school teacher, and the general store proprietor. Harlow reviewed the testimony summaries, looked at Cord, and made a notation in the margin of his file. For Luther Briggs, the matter required another day. Harlow sent an additional telegraph to the Billings deputy whose name appeared on the November report, requesting confirmation of the circumstances of the disturbance. The reply came the following morning. Carver had known something was wrong about the original story and had kept better records than most deputies kept. The young man's full account was in those records. The account was consistent with Briggs' version in every material respect. Harlow called Cord in and showed him the telegraph. "This doesn't exonerate him," Harlow said. He said it carefully, the way careful men say things they mean but don't want to mean entirely. "I know that," Cord said. "The law addresses the act, not only the intention." "I know." Harlow set the telegraph down. He looked at his notes for a while. "However," he said, "I have discretion in sentencing, and that discretion is informed by the full body of evidence, which now includes the character of the act, corroborated testimony regarding the provocation, and," he turned a page, "extensive character documentation from the period of custody." He looked at Cord. "Did you instruct these people to provide this testimony?" "No," Cord said. Harlow looked at him steadily. "Did you suggest it?" Cord thought about Berger coming to the jail with his coffee. He thought about Margaret stopping at his desk after examining Pell. He thought about Farr, who had offered to help Briggs write the affidavit before Cord had asked. "I didn't need to," he said. Harlow held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at his notes. 5 years at Deer Lodge," he said. "Good behavior considered," with an annotation in the file recommending the parole board review the corroborating evidence at the earliest eligible date. Cord nodded. He went to the cells and told Briggs. Briggs received it in the way he received most things, still with his hands folded, with the patience of a man who has learned not to want things too loudly in case they don't come. He was quiet for a long moment. "That's fair," he said. "You could contest it." "No." He shook his head, a small motion. "I killed a man. However the circumstances read, I made the choice. and I made it fast, because I was angry as well as right. 5 years is fair. And there's the parole review. There's the parole review, Cord said. Briggs nodded. He gathered his few belongings into the roll of cloth he'd arrived with. When he stood and walked to the cell door, he was very large in the small space, and Cord had the strange feeling, not for the first time since January, of looking at something that had always been present, but that he was only now seeing with any accuracy. Outside, the deputy was waiting with horses in the late March sun. Pell was already mounted, squinting against the light with the expression of someone trying to memorize a place he isn't sure he'll see again. He raised one hand toward Cord, not quite a wave, not quite a salute. Something in between. Cord raised his hand back. Briggs stopped at the door of the jail and turned. "Sheriff?" "Yes?" "You're a fair man." "I try to be." "It's harder than it looks," Briggs said. "People think tough is the hard part and fair is just what's left over. They have it exactly backward." He looked at Cord for a moment, then, "The boy will make it." "I think so too," Cord said. Briggs walked out into the light. Cord stood in the doorway and watched him go. Watched the two horses move away down the road that led east, growing smaller against the pale March sky until they were gone. He stood there for a while after they disappeared. The road was empty. The mountains to the west still held snow at their peaks. The creek ran cold and fast with snowmelt. He went back inside. Summer came to Clearwater Gulch without acknowledging what it was replacing, the way summer does everywhere, indifferent to the weight of what came before it. Ruth Abernathy wrote a long letter to her daughter in Colorado, the first she had written in 2 years, and the first honest one she had written in longer than that. She did not know if it would be answered. She sent it anyway, because the winter had clarified for her that the alternative to reaching out was not protection from disappointment. It was simply silence, and she had had enough of silence. Daniel Farr stayed. He had intended to leave for Philadelphia in June. By June, 4 families had arrived with a thaw, drawn by news of the school and a teacher's reputation that had traveled the territory through the mouths of freighters and postal riders. Farr found himself in the middle of something he could not locate a good reason to leave. He wrote to his mother that it looked, from the inside, something like happiness. She replied that she was glad for him and wished he would come home, both of which were true simultaneously, which is the nature of mothers. Thomas Beaumont renovated the saloon in April. He tore out the false wall himself, filled in the space behind it with plain lumber, and did not explain his reasons to anyone. Magnus helped with the carpentry and said nothing, which was the kind of help Beaumont most needed. The piano remained. He played it in the evenings, genuinely, for the pleasure of it, the way he'd played it before the territory had taught him to price everything. The music sounded different now. Several people noticed. No one mentioned it, because some changes don't need to be named to be real. Magnus kept his 2 horses through the winter's end and acquired 3 more in the spring from a Crow trader passing through. He said little about any of this. What he said instead, one afternoon in May, while Margaret helped him reshoe the bay mare, was that he thought he would stay on in Clearwater Gulch for another few years. Margaret said that was good. They left it there, in the way that 2 people leave things when words would only make them smaller. Doc Pruitt's flask disappeared from his coat pocket sometime in April. He did not announce this. No one asked him about it. In a community of 11 people who had spent 8 weeks learning to see each other clearly, some changes didn't need ceremony to be understood. Margaret Holty delivered 2 babies in May and 1 in June, all healthy. That summer, she began documenting her steam treatment methods for chest infections in a notebook she kept beside her medical bag. In the notebook's first entry, She wrote that the method had been demonstrated to her by a man named Luther Briggs in the winter of 1889 through the bars of a jail cell in Clearwater Gulch, Montana Territory, and that it worked. She did not editorialize the facts. Reverend Berger continued his Sunday services and continued, on occasion, holding them in the jail, even after the cells were empty, even after there was no practical reason to do so. He held them there because a church, he had concluded, should be willing to go where it was needed, rather than wait for need to come to it in the proper clothes. Elias Cord wrote 2 letters in the spring. The first went to the Territorial Parole Board in Helena on behalf of Cody Pell, citing the young man's character as observed during a period of extended shared hardship and requesting that the board consider the attached character testimony at its earliest opportunity. He understood that most things you do in the right direction don't guarantee outcomes. They only improve the odds. He sent it anyway. The second letter was harder. He wrote it 3 times before he had a version he could live with. It went to Luther Briggs at Deer Lodge Prison. He read it once more before sealing it, standing at his desk in the June light. I have been thinking about what you told me, that a man is more than the worst thing he ever did, and that you weren't entirely sure this was true, but that you hoped it. I have thought about it considerably since January, and I have come to believe it is true, though I will allow that it is easier to believe on some days than others. I also want you to know that the stove is still drawing correctly. I check it most mornings. I thought you might want to know that. I intend to be present at your parole hearing. I have already written to the board. He sealed the letter and gave it to the mail carrier and went back inside. He poured himself a cup of coffee and stood at the window of the sheriff's office and looked out at Clearwater Gulch in the June light. The store, the saloon, the livery, the church, the schoolhouse, the 6 structures that had been the whole world for 8 weeks and were now simply a small town on a road that led, eventually, to other places. He thought about the winter. He thought about 11 people and 9 people's worth of food, and a crate behind a false wall, and 4 horses that no longer existed, and a boy who could breathe again, and a man who had fixed a stove. He thought about a reverend who held church in a jail, and a doctor who had put down a flask, and a Norwegian who had said goodbye to animals he hadn't named, and done it anyway, clean and quickly, because that was what the situation required. He thought about what each of them had given, and what the difference was between giving because you had to and giving because you chose to, and whether that difference mattered as much as he'd always believed it did. He decided it mattered. But he also decided it wasn't the only thing that mattered. Sometimes you got to choose. Sometimes the situation chose for you. Either way, the giving was real. He thought about fair. He thought about how it was the hardest thing. Not the toughest thing. Not the bravest thing, but the hardest. And how almost no one understood that. And how the ones who did were the ones who kept doing it anyway. In the cold, with insufficient resources, against the arithmetic, one careful choice at a time. The summer light lay across the gulch in broad, uncomplicated sheets. The mountains to the west held snow only at their peaks now, white and distant and entirely indifferent. The creek ran full and cold. A meadowlark was doing something complicated in the direction of the livery. Cord finished his coffee. He put down the cup, picked up his hat, and went to work.